Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third meeting. We'll go ahead and get started. It's just after 2 o'clock. Welcome to the third meeting on the crisis of missing or murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives. For those of us who, or for those of you who haven't attended one of these sessions before, my name is Lisa Mantell and I'm the Deputy Director of Technical Assistance with the Police Executive Research Forum. And I'll be helping facilitate today's session with Matt from the COPS Office of the Department of Justice. This meeting is being recorded and we do plan to share the video and audio on the Operation Lady Justice website in the near future. So I want to go over a couple things with Zoom, just a few housekeeping items. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me just one moment. Okay, does everyone see the PowerPoint slide? Yes, okay, yeah. Great. It worked. So we're doing that. Okay. Okay, so just a few logistics and housekeeping items. For the best audio quality, we do ask that you stay on mute unless you're speaking. We will have time for questions and discussion at the end of each presentation. And when that time comes, please go ahead and unmute yourself. You can also ask a question in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that throughout this session. And I believe in the chat box, there is a function where you can raise your hand to indicate that you have something to say. I will send out the presentation slides to everybody following the meeting. If anyone runs into any technical difficulties with your audio or video, go ahead and leave the meeting and then try re-entering. I've also added the call-in information to the chat window for those of you who would prefer to call in and switch your audio to phone only. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Before we get started with the presentations, I would like to have everybody introduce themselves. I will begin with today's presenters. Jennifer, why don't we start with you? If you could please tell us your name and where you're from.
Sure. Hello, my name is Jennifer Stiles. I am a program manager with the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Thanks, Jennifer. And BJ?
Good afternoon. I'm BJ Spalmer. I'm currently the Executive Director of Operations for NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System.
Thank you. And Bruce?
Sorry, Lisa, he was running from another meeting. I'm not sure he's with us yet.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. How about Jeff?
Hi, my name is Jeff Lindsay, and I'm with the University of Tennessee's Law Enforcement Innovation Center.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, and now let's move on to the participants. Let me just pull up the participant window here. Okay, how about Mr. Hutchinson?
Oh, sorry about that. My name is Hal Hutchinson. I'm with the Chittimacha Tribal Police in Louisiana.
Thank you. Mr. Altman?
Yes, my name is Shane Altman. I'm the Lieutenant of Criminal Investigations for the Seminole Police Department with the Seminole Tribe of Florida.
Thank you. Mr. O'Rourke?
Hello, my name is Greg O'Rourke. I'm the Chief of Police for the Yurok Tribal Police Department up in Northern California.
Thank you. Mr. Kane? Stephen Kane, I'm not sure if you're able to introduce yourself. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to Samuel White.
My name's Sam White. I'm the Chief of Police for Lower Elwha Police Department.
Thank
up here
you.
in Port Angeles, Washington.
Thank you. Mike Lasnier. Mike Lasnier, if you'd like to go off mute, unmute yourself and introduce yourself, go ahead. Okay, perhaps we're having some audio issues. Brett Pearson.
Morning, I'm Brett Pearson. I'm a sergeant with Kalispell Tribal Police in Eastern Washington.
Thank you. Clarence Billigotti.
Hello, I'm Clarence Billigotti, Police Chief for Pueblo Sandia Police Department and Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Thank you. Brian Potratz.
Hi, I'm Brian Potratz. I'm an investigator with the Leech Lake Tribal Police Department in northern Minnesota.
Thank you. Christopher Parsons.
Hi, Chris Parsons, Chief of Police for the Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe in northern Nevada.
Thank you. And Jonathan Stia.
Hello, Lieutenant Jonathan Stia, Patrol Lieutenant for the White Mountain Apache Police Department.
Thank you. And I think that was all of the law enforcement representatives. If I didn't get to you, if there's anyone that I didn't get to, please go ahead and introduce yourself now.
Hello, this is Chief Mike Lasner with the Suquamish Tribe in Washington State. I got my audio issues resolved. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Okay, and then I'd like to turn it over to Marcia and to introduce yourself.
Sure. This is Marcia Good. I'm the Executive Director of the Presidential Task Force on Missing and Murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives, also known as Operation Lady Justice. Matt and I work together on carrying out the executive order and the tasks that are contained therein.
Thank you. And if there's anybody on the phone that I wasn't able to get to, go ahead and introduce yourself as well. Looks like we have at least one person on the phone.
Hello, I am Lieutenant Stephen Kane with the White Mountain Apache Police here in White River, Arizona.
Thank you. Okay, and now I'd like to turn it over to Matt to go ahead and introduce himself.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third of our 4 sessions supporting Operation Lady Justice on the missing or murdered Indigenous persons issue. My name is Matt Lizakowski, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Tribal Affairs for the Office of Community Oriented Policing Services, or as most of you probably know us, the COPS Office here in the Department of Justice. Welcome to the session today. I'm really excited to for today's session, we have a couple of great presenters to talk about 2 of the ways that the COPS Office is supporting Operation Lady Justice. And that is, the first one's going to be the volunteer engagement program that we're working on with IACP. And Jennifer is going to talk to you about that program that we've been supporting for the last several months. And then BJ and Jeff will talk to you about the Unresolved Cases Technical Assistance Program that we also have ongoing to support Operation Lady Justice. And as Lisa mentioned, we'll have opportunity for discussion and Q&A after each of their presentations. So don't be shy, jump in with those questions. And then as we wrap up after the 2 presentations, we can also have some additional time for sort of an open Q&A if we have that opportunity and time, which I think we will probably have. So I think that's all I have today. Again, just on behalf of the COPS Office, thank you all for your support and joining us today. Really excited to have the discussion today and look forward to additional ways that we can support tribal law enforcement from the Department of Justice here at the COPS office. So I think I can turn it over to Jennifer for our volunteer engagement program discussion first.
Great, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today and talk with you a little bit about the work that we're doing on the volunteer engagement program. I'm going to go to the next slide. So essentially, wanted to talk with you about a little bit about the initiative and the partners that we're working with, talk about some of the benefits of volunteer engagement, some of the different ways that you can engage volunteers, and then talk to you about some training opportunities that we have for tribes. Go ahead to the next slide. So this is kind of the summary of our purpose. What we're really talking about here is ways to bring together tribal leaders with community partners to support missing person cases, support victims and their families, and promote healing. I feel the partners probably need no introduction, so I won't go into the details of the Operation Lady Justice and the COPS office, as I know you know them all well. But I did want to emphasize, we've been working really closely with Matt and Marcia at the respective organizations to make sure that all of the work that we do is really consistent with and supportive of the recommendations of the task force, as well as the needs they've been hearing from those listening sessions. For instance, we've been working also closely with Ernie Wyand, who I think spoke with all of you on the last roundtable that you had, but making sure that some of the work that we're doing is supporting the community response plans. And we see this volunteer program as a really natural progression of some of that work. So, and I don't know if all of you are familiar with IACP. I did want to give a quick, update on who we are. We are the International Association of Chiefs of Police. We're a law enforcement association. We do a lot of grant-funded work really across the spectrum of criminal justice topics. We do have an Indian country law enforcement section. We've got about 100 tribal law enforcement leaders who are part of that, and they're really the voice for our tribal law enforcement work. And they, along with our staff, have supported a number of different tribal grant projects, including the Census of Tribal Law Enforcement Agencies and some additional work around smaller rural and tribal considerations for crime reduction and peer support that we've done at the COPS office as well. So one of the other IACP programs that kind of brings us here today is the Volunteers in Police Service program. This is something that we started just after 9/11 with support from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. It was a program that was really focused on helping law enforcement agencies use volunteers effectively in ways that were supporting their operations and building community partnerships. It started out with a big focus on emergency preparedness, so disaster response, terrorism, things of that nature that were really very much in the news in that post 9/11 timeframe. But as the program evolved, we really began to see the potential for different types of emergency situations, and one of those was missing person cases. You'll see a photo here of a document that we did a number of years back specific to missing persons. And if you can switch to that next slide. Wanted to share a couple of highlights just to showcase some ways that police departments have been using missing person volunteers and some of the things that really got us thinking about the potential for this type of work to support tribal missing person cases. Las Vegas, Nevada, for instance, they were seeing 10,000 missing person calls a year. Obviously very large agency with many people. But they've been able to really effectively use volunteers through their outreach efforts with phone calls and flyers, but also, more technical skilled search functions as well. Also, the Montgomery County, Maryland Police Department, they were seeing an issue with their juvenile missing persons, runaway juveniles. So they were able to bring in volunteers who went through social media, just publicly available sources to try to find information, and they were able to close quite a few of those missing cases. And finally, I wanted to highlight the Santa Cruz County, California Sheriff's Office. This agency chose to focus on their cold cases with volunteers. They had a big backlog of cold cases, so they brought in actually a skilled volunteer, a retired officer who was able to come in and had the time to go through all of the old cases, and he was able to close about 100 cases in a year recently. So these are some examples just to get us thinking about some of the potential as you think about what some of those needs might be in your own tribes. Next slide, please. So just kind of wanted to help us define, kind of taking all that we learned from the VIPs program and looking to define what we're doing with the Tribal Volunteer Management Program. I think that the first bullet really sums up what we're looking to do here. It's to be a formalized effort to recruit and train and manage volunteers. So these volunteers would serve at the discretion of tribal leadership, but typically would be overseen by the law enforcement agency. And we know certainly in tribes, you have many stakeholders, and there's a real opportunity with this formalized collaboration to bring in some of your other victim services, your community stakeholders, and make sure that essentially everyone knows what everyone else is doing. And we'll talk a little bit more about the process and the benefits of this as we go. So jumping to the next slide, thinking about the why of this, what are the benefits? Really, I know it's no surprise to many of you that law enforcement agencies are often under-resourced and understaffed. The volunteers can really be that force multiplier to help your officers focus on those higher level things that they need to do, their investigative duties, and making sure that the volunteers are given something to do that is helpful to you and not getting in the way of the things that you need to do. There's real opportunity as well for that, community police engagement. It gives you that opportunity to build relationships by giving them, a way to help. We know that in missing person events, people will come out in masses and in droves, and by having a volunteer program, you're able to give them something to do that is helpful, again, and not going to disrupt the other things that you have going on, but really gives tribal members and volunteers that sense of purpose and that way to contribute meaningfully. So I'm sure many of you already have volunteers in a number of different capacities within your tribes. So, why go to all the effort here? Why formalize? And there's really some important structural reasons behind this. By giving yourself some structure to make sure that volunteers are being used effectively, you're essentially, we're going to talk a little bit at the end about some of your risk management opportunities, but you're making sure that, again, volunteers are doing things that are helpful, that you know where they are, that you don't have a million people scattered off in a million different directions doing what they think is helping. It really gives you some accountability and control over what volunteers are doing. And I'm sure I'll say it many more times, but really we focus heavily on the coordination aspect of this volunteer program, making sure that all of your stakeholders, all of your tribal agencies, all of your law enforcement partners know who is doing what, so we're able to minimize some of that duplication of efforts and make sure everyone really understands where the volunteers fit in. And it's also helpful on the volunteers part as well. I mean, coming back to that, we know they'll show up issue. If there's one designated point of contact and one defined process for them to follow, it makes it easier on those volunteers and those tribal members, and it makes it easier on all of you and your staff if you've got a place to send them. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about using your volunteers during that crisis, and that is absolutely something that they can do. They can be trained for many things to help in terms of the search itself, in terms of those outreach activities, victim services. But I do encourage everyone to think about, the other phases along this, the planning and prevention and the follow-up and the recovery. Because essentially, if we haven't thought about it until the crisis, we haven't gotten as ready as we could be. So there's a lot of work that can be done in that planning stage. So you can actually get your volunteers ready to go. You can train them, you can do drills with them so that when something happens, they are ready to go, ready to call out at that moment's notice when you really need them. But there's also really great opportunities to engage them in crime prevention activities and some of the things that will help your overall community safety. And I'm sure, again, many of you probably do these things and maybe don't even call it volunteering. So it's just kind of sometimes a matter, I think, of reframing some of the things that you are doing and giving them a little bit more structure and support so that you're able to build up that core of engaged folks who can really help you when you need it. And then, of course, there is that follow-up and recovery stage. We know that the active search is going to end, but there's a lot of ways that volunteers can support those victims and families and continue to help law enforcement collect information, process information about some of those cases that are not active any longer. So we've talked about a few of these, but I think it's important to highlight the breadth of things that volunteers can do. I think there's this perception often that volunteers will stuff envelopes and do some filing and that's it. And they can, those are great things for them to do. But there's really a lot of different ways that you can engage volunteers that maximize skills that maybe you don't have in the agency, or again, give officers time to do those things that maybe they could do, but they don't have time for. So just listed a few of these things here too. I did want to highlight the one on the bottom, managing other volunteers. And one of the things that we hear a lot from law enforcement is that we don't have time to manage volunteers. So you could actually train a volunteer to do that for you, which is a really huge benefit. Once, again, you come to those missing person searches and you have hundreds of people who've shown up because they want to help, but you just don't know what to do with them. So having that volunteer manager is a really important role. And the other thing I wanted to highlight here is really making sure that we're not saying everyone has to do all of these things by any means. It's very customizable, this kind of volunteer program. A tribe can start with one job, they can start with two, and build out. There's no one way to do this. There's a lot of different opportunities. We can jump to the next slide. So this is a common question, what volunteers cannot do. There is a BIA prohibition on reserve or volunteer type of activities. So we do want to make sure that volunteers are not doing any sort of sworn law enforcement work. They're not doing patrol, they're not doing investigations, they're not in databases they shouldn't be in. So there's definite limitations on this, and it's important to make sure the volunteers understand that, and all of your partners as well as your officers, just to make sure that there are no liability issues there. And certainly anything that poses security or a safety risk is a consideration as well. We don't want to send someone out to do deep water rescue if they're not trained to do that. And we'll get a little bit into that liability and risk management in this next slide. We know that all jobs have risks. This is a pretty common concern with volunteer programs and has been, I think, since the start of volunteers in police service. Am I taking on extra risk by managing volunteers? And I think, as we've seen, there are ways that we can minimize those risks to the agency, to the tribe. One of which is pre-screen your applicants. We want to make sure that we have the right people doing the right jobs and at the right skill level, so that we're not having folks who are in over their head or doing things that they don't know how to do. By having that formal program, you're able to train them, give them what they need to know, not only understanding their role, but also understanding how to do it, which is a really important part of maintaining that safety and risk management. Also supervision, we can make sure that volunteers have someone to ask if they don't know what to do, making sure they have someone to go to who can help them with that, and making sure that you have someone keeping an eye on what the volunteers are doing and having that person designated in advance so that when an event happens, you have a plan for who is going to keep an eye on the volunteers. And finally, back to that improved coordination piece, I think, again, we run into a lot of challenges of one side not knowing what the other side is doing during some of these larger events. So having volunteers who can help those communication channels is a really important part of what volunteers can do. So on the next slide, so that was kind of the mini version of what volunteer management could look like in a tribe. We do have a new training program that we've just started piloting this summer with the Yakima tribe. It's a two-phase training. It includes a leadership meeting that is an hour and a half. A lot of the content that we went over here, but in a little bit more detail, talking through what the program is, how it can help the tribe, and making sure that starting this kind of effort is going to be a good fit for the tribe, and really building that buy-in with leadership and law enforcement and any of your key stakeholders who you think are important to have as a part of that conversation. And then we follow it up with an 8-hour training about volunteer management. And this really digs deeper into some of those topics that we just glanced over, but really the how to build it and how to sustain your program in terms of thinking about what it is you want those volunteers to do, what their policies are going to be, what they can and can't do, and what their roles are going to be, as well as back to that risk management and training and all of those other pieces that go into making sure that your volunteers are ready. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is funded through the Collaborative Reform Technical Assistance Center with the CRITAC program. This is funded by the COPS office in partnership with the IACP and 9 other major law enforcement associations. So if you are interested in learning more about this volunteer program, we are able to offer this training through the CRITAC program. And we have a number of other resources as well for training and technical assistance. We can jump over to the next slide. I can show you a little bit more about what those services are. So there's many things that one can do through CRITAC, which I just think it's always important for law enforcement agencies to know. It can be this training program specifically. We have a wide variety of other training topics as well. You'll see our list here that we pulled for specifically for tribes. And this is an ever evolving list of kind of the key topics that law enforcement agencies are looking for and asking for in this time. So these can be virtual trainings, they can be consultations. We have a couple of tribal consultations going on now that are looking at policy guidance and developing MOUs. So essentially, if there's anything we can help you with at the CRITAC, please let us know, and we are happy to talk through some of those needs with you. I have one more slide kind of on the how it works. So you can visit collaborativereform.org. It's a very simple process. There's no forms, just a very basic kind of tell us what you need, and we'll talk with you more about what that need is. So we've tried to make it as simple as possible. There are no fees associated with any of these services. So that's my contact information. I'd love if anyone has questions or thoughts about how they've used volunteers. I'm happy to take any questions.
Jennifer, I'll also just jump in briefly from the COPS office. We're really excited to advance the volunteer engagement program with IACP through CRITAC. It really fits in nicely with the COPS office mission in advancing community policing. It's a nice way to build community trust by using volunteers from the community, I think. It really could be one of those key ways that communities can engage with your department in a productive way, and like Jennifer was mentioning, in a way that's not only meaningful to them, but also to you as the tribal law enforcement agency. So please jump in with some questions, or if you have experience using volunteers at your law enforcement agency, please feel free to let us know how you've been using them and how you think this program might be able to help. Definitely want to have some discussion here on the volunteer engagement program.
Has anyone had an incident where you've had a large group of volunteers show up for any sort of crisis? That's one we've been hearing quite a bit about recently.
And feel free to just unmute yourself and go ahead. We're a pretty small group here.
Well, if any questions do come up, or if this is something that you'd like to talk through with other folks in your tribe or your agency, we are really interested in how to make this program meet your needs. So please feel free to reach out to me or to Matt, and we're happy to talk with you more about what this might look like with your tribe.
Thanks, Jennifer. Any questions on the volunteer engagement program? And Jennifer will be on through the end, so we can have questions about that after the next presentation as well. But one more chance for any questions here. All right, thanks, Jennifer. We'll hopefully engage a little bit later with some questions after BJ and Jeff talk next about the Unresolved Cases Technical Assistance Project.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and thank you to everyone as well for giving us this time here today to talk about a project that we're really excited and grateful to be working on with the COPS office. We'll be talking about a project that is still in development, which makes this a great opportunity for us to start messaging the work that's being done and the topics that are being addressed in this project, so that we can solicit and gather feedback from subject matter experts like yourself that are around our virtual meeting table today, because we know that all of you have so much hands-on experience and such intimate knowledge of some of the challenges that go into investigating these long-term unresolved cases, what law enforcement traditionally has referred to as cold cases. We know you have so much familiarity with the unique challenges to these case types, as well as to investigations within Indian country. So for us to have this opportunity to present what we're doing now and solicit feedback from the experts will help us make this program even better. So our goal today is really to give you a high-level overview of the project that's currently in progress. And then after the presentation, solicit that feedback. And then if we run out of time today to discuss any feedback that you might have, we would welcome hearing from everyone after the presentation today. So what we want to do is kind of cover all the topics that we are working on in this project, and then hear from you if there are other topics or challenges or resources that we haven't included yet that we really should consider. And of course, the goal of the project is to produce a training and technical assistance program that will support law enforcement, tribal law enforcement agencies across the country in developing their own protocols for cold case investigations. So if we could move to the next slide. And of course, as Matt mentioned, this is a project that's made possible through the COPS office. It's a cooperative agreement and a collaboration between the COPS office, the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification, or what we call UNTCHI, and the University of Tennessee Law Enforcement Innovation Center. So myself and Dr. Bedoli from the UNTCHI are a part of this project. And for those that are not familiar with UNTCHI, in addition to managing the day-to-day operations of NamUs, Dr. Bedoli also operates a number of forensic laboratories, including a dedicated missing persons laboratory that can develop and upload mitochondrial DNA profiles to CODIS for resolution of some of these long-term missing person cases as well. So you'll have all of our contact information in your handouts. And we do welcome, again, after the presentation today, if you have additional feedback, we would welcome the opportunity to talk with you more. And so I will stop and defer to Jeff on the next slide. Jeff, if you wanted to provide a bit more introduction to yourself and LEIC.
Thank you, BJ. Yeah, my name is Jeff Lindsay, as the slide tells me, so just in case I forgot. I am a program manager here at the University of Tennessee Law Enforcement Innovation Center. I came to LEIC after 26 years in the FBI, and my primary investigative focus in the FBI was violent crimes, both as a frontline investigator and then also as a supervisor. And then later in my career, I spent 8 years at the FBI Criminal Justice Information Services Division in Clarksburg and learned a lot as a knuckle dragon investigator about high-tech solutions, high-tech applications for solving crimes, preventing crimes, and for sharing information. And my primary position there was in running information sharing systems. And full disclosure, we're going to highlight one, the National Data Exchange here that I ran for several years before I left the FBI. So we have a couple of folks here that are helping me, a gentleman by the name of Tim Shade and Jason Jones, and they are the leads for our National Forensic Academy, which is a 10-week crime scene investigators course, and they do shorter courses as well. But they are looking at ways that in the technical assistance phase, especially, that we can emphasize or provide information about forensic techniques that will aid investigators in these unresolved cases come to a conclusion much faster. So I'll hand it back to BJ as we proceed.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Jennifer, if you could, I'm sorry, Lisa, if you could move to the next slide. So of course, the information on this slide is not new information to this group. We all know the challenges that are involved in investigating any long-term case in really any local, state, tribal, or federal agency. These are challenges that are not unique to law enforcement across the country. We know that lack of federal legislation mandating the use of NCIC and NamUs for missing adult cases creates gaps. We know that agencies across the country have limited resources, whether they be personnel or in-house forensic capabilities or funding to outsource forensic services. We know that creates gaps. The lack of consistent protocols across local, state, and tribal agencies creates gaps in case resolutions and information sharing. But we've also learned, of course, there are complex jurisdictional issues that take place when investigating cases in Indian country. So knowing all of these challenges and more, one of the goals of our project was to create some information, best practices, protocols that will help agencies develop those in-house cold case investigation protocols that are informed by all of these resources and tools and best practices that are collecting from agencies across the country. So if we can go to the next slide, we wanted to highlight really the two deliverables that we are producing as part of this project are first, that best practices, sort of an investigative guidebook for these long-term unresolved cases. And the idea behind the guidebook is to provide not just training information, but looking at how to best utilize some of these tools to resolve cases so that all of that information can be used by tribal agencies across the country to inform the development of their own cold case or unresolved case protocols. And using that guidebook and the information that's contained in that guidebook will then move into the training and technical assistance portion of the program, where we'll actually be providing that training to tribal law enforcement agencies across the country. And that will include some on-site technical assistance to several tribal law enforcement agencies. So again, because this program or this project is currently in progress, right now, we are still in the investigative guidebook stage. So we're building out that guidebook, and this again is the area where we welcome feedback to incorporate more into that. Next slide, please. So to kind of solicit that feedback, we wanted to give you sort of a high-level overview of some of the topics that we're covering. So of course, why is it important to develop these protocols in the first place? And then to talk about who is your unresolved case team. Even if you don't officially have an unresolved case team in your department, who are you going to incorporate into that team? So we talk about the need for bringing everyone who's going to be involved in these case resolutions into that investigative team from the start. So not just the investigators reviewing the file, but talking about incorporating your forensic analysts, your prosecutors, your victim service providers. Jeff will talk a little bit about the protocols and locating, accounting, and prioritizing cases, so I won't go into detail there. But we're also including some information on forensic technologies, database technologies, talking about resources that exist today that maybe didn't exist 5, 10, or 15 years ago when that case occurred, things that present solvability factors today that didn't exist before. And from the feedback that we're getting from people in the field, we're going to start incorporating some other investigative considerations, legal considerations, things that you bring to our attention that you think would be beneficial to include in an investigative guidebook. And of course, looking at incorporating not just culturally informed victim services, but trauma-informed victim services, because we've learned how different some of these case types are. Families who have a missing person are going through an ambiguous loss. They're dealing with a trauma that's very different from the family of a homicide victim. For the missing families, until a body is recovered, it is completely up to each individual family member to decide whether that missing loved one is deceased or alive. It's a very different type of trauma that they endure. And we want to, of course, leave the end of this guidebook with a resource contact list, because we want to make sure that if agencies don't have access to a resource, a forensic resource or a database, if they don't have access to something in-house today, we want to leave them with a contact directory of here's who they can contact if they need access to this database that we've talked about. Or if they don't have this forensic service in-house, here's who they can contact for that service. So for us and for that resource contact list, we welcome feedback there as well. So if you're familiar with some victim services out in the field, or you're familiar with some other resources or databases that we've not discussed, we would love to hear from you to incorporate those as well. Good news to the next slide, please. Jeff, I think I'm deferring to you on this one, correct?
Okay, thank you, BJ. And just by way of background from the process that we're looking at this from, at least particularly me, is we know all just about every law enforcement agency today is under-resourced in some way or the other, big or small, and there's some that have more resources than others, but especially in Indian country where there are so many disadvantages from a resource perspective, in addition to all the other challenges. My thought is not so much in focusing this on agencies that are able to have a dedicated cold case unit or agencies that have, in relative terms, more resources than some of the smaller ones. But my thought process is what can be useful for that frontline investigator that has one or two unresolved cases, that is working other cases. How can he or she leverage the resources that are out there in addition to their investigative skills and techniques to come to the best possible solution for that particular case, regardless of what it originates from. So that's the perspective I'm coming from, and please, we're looking for input throughout this process. As BJ emphasized, we're still working on getting to that TA part of it. But in the research and interviews and more academic investigation that I've done, informed a little bit by my own investigative background, see some emerging best practices for protocols. I'll digress here. I talked to Ernie Wyan last week and was getting a little bit about his project up there. And one of the things that he informed me of from his experience and his interactions with the tribal law enforcement agencies that he's worked with is that there's not as much of a demand, or doesn't appear to be as much of a demand, for specific protocols for us to promulgate, to put out for everybody. There are excellent examples of protocols. BIA, Office of Justice Services, has some exceptional protocols. The NIJ working group, cold case investigation working group, has put out some protocols. There's some state protocols. But what we want to do is take a step back and look at what, in addition to the protocols and developing those protocols, what are some steps that are promising or that have been time proven in terms of getting the resolution to a case. And we know that resolution is going to be what it is. You hope to find a long-term missing person alive, but you may find remains instead. So, especially in unresolved cases, you hope to resolve the case, and you may reopen the case or start reinvestigation of the case, but you still may work it for a period of time and realize that at this point in time we still have no leads. But in the meantime, what kind of progress can we make towards somebody eventually coming to the best resolution for that case? Interestingly enough, today's hot case, as BJ said in one of our correspondences, could be tomorrow's unresolved case. And one of the best things that we can do right now for future unresolved cases is do as an extensive and thorough initial investigation as is possible. Case in point, Jessica Veltri, who's an Army CID special agent, worked a unresolved homicide and sexual assault case out of Colorado Springs from 1987. In 2019, they finally found the capacity to test some DNA evidence that had not been testable before, and so it ultimately led to the arrest, the identification and arrest of the subject, who's awaiting trial now. But one of her points, in addition to the technical capacity that had been developed that wasn't there initially, was how thorough the initial investigators were on the crime scene. And the key was picking up 3 cigarette butts that contained DNA that could have been overlooked. But those 3 cigarette butts proved absolutely crucial to providing the DNA that was used to identify the murderer. So that is something that we can do now. And again, that was consistent in my research in terms of what is one of the factors that works toward the solvability of a case. And one is a thorough initial investigation, which doesn't mean that anybody working an unresolved case can't go back and recanvass, which is one of the steps. But that thorough initial investigation helps tremendously and get into a solution phase. One of the other points, and I'm not going to read every bullet, I just want to highlight a couple as we go forward, is having that solvability matrix. And what's crucial about that is that there are cases that have more of an emotional connection for investigators and also for communities. They may be more recent than some of the other unresolved cases. They may have had a higher profile, but they may not be the most solvable or the most readily solvable cases that are on your investigative list of resources. So being very as pragmatic as possible, and certainly there are a lot of variables that need to go into a solvability matrix, but being very pragmatic and practical about the cases that stand the best probability of having a good resolution and putting your resources toward those. It doesn't mean that you forget about or you don't address the other cases, but going for those that can be solved, or at least have the highest probability of being solved. Because even though they may not have the emotional attachments, they're still a victim or surviving family members that are attached to that case as well. And that should be the overall goal, although that can be challenging sometimes. We've addressed several times having the skilled and motivated investigators trained in trauma. And another way I'm looking at this particular project, especially in the technical assistance phase, is to increase investigative competency and capacity for the investigators, and at the same time emphasizing the need to exercise cultural literacy throughout an investigation, especially for those agencies that might be involved that do not have the affiliations that some of the primary investigators may have. Next slide, please. All right, so proactively engage other criminal justice stakeholders. None of us really work in a vacuum anymore. And again, going from that mindset of that individual investigator who's already got a lot of cases, that's working in a under-resourced agency already, how can they maximize their investigative throw weight? And that is to, employ the resources of every agency that's got any type of jurisdiction or got any type of resource that can be applied to the case. So you may have a multi-layered investigation where someone is putting more effort on that particular case, at one level, but there's other agencies, other investigators that are interested, and they may have a resource that may be singular in nature, but may be the resource that, if applied correctly, can provide a significant lead, or in some cases even solve the case if they're engaged. So working on multiple levels is incredibly important. It was interesting, we did not necessarily coordinate this, but Jennifer, speaking about using the volunteers, one of the across the board recommended for large and small entities that have cold case or unresolved case squads is how critical having properly vetted volunteers involved in the case is toward helping with solvability. And that's everything from folks reviewing your case and looking for gaps that you might not otherwise notice, to following up, rereading interviews, suggesting interview techniques, but all the things that volunteers can do if they're properly vetted and confident in whatever skill they're being asked to exercise, that can free up the investigator then to do what only the investigator can do as a sworn law enforcement individual. Also, not forgetting about, there's a whole plethora of universities and educational research entities out there that can take a look at a cold case or an unresolved case and perhaps give you some idea, either from a forensic perspective or even from a behavioral perspective, or any type of other perspective that could be leveraged to moving that case forward. Next slide, please. Knowing what you don't know is important, but knowing what you do know but don't know that you know it is critically important too. So a lot of times for these unresolved cases, especially over time, you're going to have case files that are in the old building that you used to occupy that somebody forgot in the locker. There's been cases where investigators have become so attached to a case that they've kept some of the original files themselves to work on after they've left the agency in retirement. But consolidating all the information about a particular case in general, if that's your level of focus, or if you're looking at more from a systemic perspective, a unit perspective, all your cold cases, unresolved cases. And having it in a searchable case management database is critical, so that not only the current cadre of investigators and analysts and volunteers that are working on it can know what's going on, but any future cadre of investigators and analysts and volunteers can have that information readily accessible. And that does not need to be expensive. It does not necessarily need to be something that is very complicated. There's so many programs now, Excel spreadsheets even, but a lot of different programs can allow you to do that, to consolidate that. The other one is a comprehensive communications plan, and that's a 360 plan. That's not just with the media, but that's also with community members, family members, vested volunteers, and even in your own agency in terms of everybody having the same common operating picture across the agency with a particular case, but also for all the different investigative agencies, excuse me, that are working the case as well. And then the final is to continue to seek funding sources, grants, not just from the government, but from philanthropic organizations, folks that give away money to do good things. That's another option that you have as well. So I will turn it back over to BJ to close and stand by for any questions or comments.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And of course, we want to include a discussion of some of the advances in forensic technologies that are going to help agencies solve these cases today that maybe could have been solved just 2, 3, 4 years ago with the technology that existed at that time. So for each of these topics, what we'll be including is a bit of a primer so that if anyone does want to dive a bit more in depth into the science of the DNA and fingerprints and odontology, they can, but also with just some best practices, recommendations for using these technologies to their greatest benefit. With DNA typing and database searching, we'll talk about the different types of DNA profiles. We'll talk about nuclear versus mitochondrial DNA and why mitochondrial DNA is so important in missing and unidentified person investigations. Talk about some of the newer techniques and technologies, so familial DNA searching through CODIS, some of the genealogy searching that's taking place. With fingerprints, we'll make sure as well that everyone is aware of the 2 separate and distinct federal fingerprint databases that don't necessarily overlap in the information that they contain. So we'll talk about why it's so important, especially for unidentified decedent cases, to run those fingerprints through both the FBI's NGI, Next Generation Identification System, and the Homeland Security's IDENT system. And we'll also include a discussion of forensic odontology and how that can be utilized for rapid identification of remains when someone has gone missing. We can move to the next slide, Lisa. And then finally, with databases, we wanted to talk about some of the more common systems that are used for not just missing and unidentified persons, but for unresolved sexual assault, homicides, other violent crimes. For missing and unidentified, we've included a thorough discussion of NCIC and NamUs. In addition to explaining those systems and the data that they contain and how that can be utilized to do some really advanced searching, we're also including a discussion of the similarities and differences between the 2 systems, because we do get those questions come up a lot. So we talk about the differences between NCIC and NamUs. And there's also a discussion of NCIC offline searches, because that's a really powerful investigative tool to be able to go to NCIC and run very specific queries of keyword searches and even canceled cases that will show some examples of how those searches actually ended in case resolution. So Jeff had given a great example earlier today, talking about a case example of a resolution. We're peppering those throughout the guide so that we can not just talk about these resources, but give a real world example of how they were utilized to resolve a case. Of course, we'll talk about VICAP, not just for missing and unidentified, but also for those sexual assaults, homicide cases that have unknown offenders, and how that system is utilized to share information across jurisdictional boundaries and really do some in-depth analysis of that case data. We'll talk about NVIX as another system, not just to compare case information, but to really allow different jurisdictions and agencies to all collaborate within one system to perform analysis, link analysis, and share case data. And then, of course, a short discussion as well of NIBIN for comparison of ballistic evidence. So looking at violent crimes that involve firearms and how NIBIN is used to compare that forensic evidence. So Lisa, if we could move to the next slide, please. So again, that's really a high-level overview of some of the information that we're currently working to incorporate in the guidebook and later the technical assistance and training program. And again, kind of soliciting that feedback. But before we open things up for questions or feedback, Matt, did you want to add anything else to the discussion?
Thanks, BJ, Jeff. No, not really. I just wanted to, again, reiterate, this was a program that the COPS office funded in late 2020. And this project, is really just getting going and getting into the sort of meat of the project. And this is an opportunity for you all to help shape what the final deliverables will look like and what the technical assistance, could include. So it is an opportunity to do that. And I welcome everyone's sort of comments and feedback on these questions that can help BJ and Jeff, develop the most effective program possible for tribal law enforcement. As Jeff had mentioned, we know there are significant resource challenges in tribal law enforcement, and we know that you may not be able to form unresolved case teams, formal teams, but what can that one investigator that your department has, what can be most effective to help them resolve these long-term unresolved cases. So I'll turn it back over to you, BJ and Jeff, to help facilitate the question discussion here.
Great. And Lisa, if you'll flip to the next slide, we've recapped those topics again to see if that might help with some prompting discussion to remind everyone what's in the current protocol. So we'd like to just open it up. If anyone has any questions, comments, feedback, we'd love to hear it. We've got a comment in the chat about highlighting NamUs, that a lot of agencies don't know about NamUs. So yeah, we definitely want to highlight that system and also talk about the ability for families to participate in NamUs. So families can enter a missing person case into NamUs. Of course, that will be vetted before it's ever published for anyone to see. It'll be confirmed with law enforcement. But I think that is also a really powerful tool for agencies to know about, not just for their internal use, but also to give the families that feeling of empowerment and involvement in the search for their missing loved one as well.
Also, if your agency has some examples of unresolved cases that have been, that you have come to a successful resolution on, feel free to jump in and share, what worked in those cases for you that Jeff and BJ should be aware of as they develop these resources.
Hi, this is Greg O'Rourke. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead,
Yes.
Chief.
I would really like to complement incorporating not just cultural services, but also trauma-informed victim services. In my experience, especially now going into my several decades of law enforcement, I've seen family members of victims not receive those services and then fall into a similar trap. So I would really like to congratulate recognizing that and incorporating this into the strategy for investigation and for preventative measure.
Thank you, Chief O'Rourke. We appreciate that. And if there are specific victim services that anyone would recommend that be included in the resource contact guide, we welcome that as well. And of course, you know, anything that you think of after today's presentation, you'll have our contact information in the handout. So we'd love to hear from you if you want to email, call, follow up with us on any other recommendations after today.
I'll also just see if this prompts any feedback, but one of the comments that we've heard a lot of from the field is the law enforcement communication and engagement with families on these unresolved cases, and see if anyone has experience and best practices or ideas on things that we can include about how you continue that communication with family members over the long-term unresolved cases.
If I can add in on that, what we do is we don't have any cold cases, but on our long-term cases with victims involved, we have a trained victim coordinator that is more in an admin position and wasn't ever around for arrest or anything like that. And in dealing with the victims and the kids, they were not seen as a threat like during the first one or whatever it was. And that third person, victim coordinator, we have found is much more able to deal with the family because they're kind of an outside party.
Thanks for that feedback. It's helpful. BJ, Jeff, anything else you want to kind of highlight as areas that you're looking for some specific feedback on, or?
How about databases? Does anyone else, does anyone have other databases that you use that you find really beneficial to case investigations, even if it's an off-the-shelf case management tool?
Hello, this is Chris Parsons, Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe. Some of the things I've worked in 2 different tribes now as chief of police, and the technology gap, I think, in Indian country is tremendous. Even trying to enter a missing person is a struggle for a lot of tribal law enforcement agencies. Sometimes we have to rely on a working relationship with the county sheriff's department or a city PD that has a 24-hour dispatch center to do that for us. But unfortunately, they're not obliged to do that. So sometimes you cannot achieve that working relationship. And then I've found that when you don't have that assistance from the county, you go to your federal partners, such as BIA, and you find out that they really don't have a mechanism to enter a missing person from, that the tribal police take the report of missing person. They don't have a mechanism for us to pass that to them, for them to enter it into NCIC, which I found that rather interesting, being a federal agency. And the other part of Indian country is a lot of these tribes that I've noticed, they're hesitant to share information about tribal members, whether they're missing or criminal matters or whatever, and putting that information into the NCIC system. That we're just now in Pyramid Lake have the ability to do that through the TAP program. But still, there's an ongoing discussion with the tribe is how much information they're going to allow us to put into the system. We've learned through this program, we've learned about NamUs, which is tremendous because we don't have to rely on the county or the federal government to internet. So that's something we can access, which is nice. So I would just say in Indian country, I mean, all of these things are wonderful. There's a ton of programs, management systems out there, but accessing them for Indian country is difficult, especially if it's a national database. And then manpower wise, you know, if you don't have that detective or someone to follow these cases, a lot of tribal PDs, they just barely have enough patrol officers to cover a 24-hour shift. And patrol officers are not the personnel you want to follow up on cases. They don't have the time. So lack of manpower, lack of accessibility to a data management system. And some of these tribes, they may not even have an internet capable of accessing NCIC where the tribe is located. I worked in a very remote agency and there was no cell phone service and there was very limited internet service. So those are issues that need to be addressed. But like I said, it's not that there's not programs out there to utilize, it's just access by tribal agencies is difficult.
I don't know if my mute was on, but we use NCMEC a lot and have always had great help with whatever we've needed. They've always either answered or put us in the right direction.
Thanks, Chief Hutchinson. Thanks, Chief Parsons. They're good comments and things to consider. We at the COPS office have continued to support the Tribal Access Program, so it's good to hear that that's working for you, Chief Parsons, and hope to continue expanding that program in the short term here. Actually, we're hoping for an application period later this year. So continuing to try and provide that, ensure that tribes have the access they need is an important priority for the COPS office. And we know that there are challenges, you know, with what information the tribe may want to submit in those databases, and you know that is up to each tribe to determine. But we want to make sure that you do have the access to query and get the information you need out of them as well. Any other questions for BJ or Jeff? And I think we can probably open it back up to Jennifer as well and the volunteer engagement program, and see if there's any questions on either of the topics for today's discussion.
Hi, this is Greg O'Rourke with Yurok Tribe again. So BJ, you had mentioned or brought up very specific databases, and I just want to confirm that, you know, state specific. So in California, we have MUPS. And so that's taken into account for our, you know, partners and allied agencies out of state.
Very good point. Thanks for bringing that up. We'll make sure that we highlight there are a lot of state clearinghouses as well, missing person clearinghouses that play a great investigative role as well.
Any other questions for BJ or Jeff or Jennifer about volunteer engagement or the Unresolved Cases project? And any other topics, feel free to raise any other areas or issues that you all are facing in the missing or murdered Indigenous persons issue area. So feel free to jump in with any questions or topics that you'd like to see us cover. We do have our fourth tribal law enforcement engagement session. It's currently scheduled for September. So we're going to take a few months off here for the summer and join back in the early fall with the funding and resources presentation. And we may also cover the tribal community response plans there that the MMIP coordinators that the Department of Justice has funded are helping tribes develop for their unique tribal locations. So that's what we're planning for the next topic in September. But if you have other ideas for topics, we can always switch things around. So you can feel free to submit any suggestions to the email there, operationladyjustice@usdoj.gov, and our website to learn more about Operation Lady Justice is operationladyjustice.usdoj.gov. We have a lot of great fact sheets on there for tribal law enforcement to learn more about the databases that we talked a little bit about, as well as areas on victim services, areas on the ongoing Operation Lady Justice, the MMIP initiative, and other activities that are occurring in support of OLJ. Any final comments? I'll leave a minute or two here in case anybody has any other thoughts or suggestions or ideas. All right, I don't think anybody will be opposed to ending a little bit early, so I'll thank BJ and Jeff and Jennifer for the presentations today, and thank you all for engaging us on these topics. And we'll be sharing the slides, as Lisa had mentioned at the beginning. We'll share the slides out to everyone, so you'll have the materials on hand, and feel free to reach out to us with any questions. Always want to support what you're doing at your tribal law enforcement agencies, and any way that we can try to do that, just let us know. And with that, we'll conclude for today and plan to see you all hopefully in September, if not before then. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.